Social change in America took a rapid progression during both the women's movement of the 19th and 20th centuries and the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The tactics and strategies most successful in creating social change in both movements were strong leaders and changing the laws throughout court cases and constitutional amendments. Strong leaders were the most effective way that the early women's movement and the civil rights movement caused social change in America. The women's suffrage movement had amazingly strong leaders. One of them was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was a woman generations before her time. She was the main leader of the early women's movement. She was known as an abolitionist. Stanton was born in Johnston, New York in 1815. She graduated from the Emma Willard School in Troy, New York in 1832. She was drawn to the abolitionist, temperance, and civil rights movements that predated the Civil War. During this time in our nation's history, it was very rare that a woman became educated at all, let alone obtain a secondary degree from a private academy. In 1840, she married Henry Stanton, a reformer. They went to London to the world's first anti-slavery convention. While there, she organized the other women to protest the fact that women were excluded from the General Assembly of the conference. After she met Susan B. Anthony in the early 1850s, Stanton was one of the nation's leaders for women's civil rights in general, and especially the right for women to divorce and for the right to vote. She had 7 children and still managed to do all of those things to champion the rights of women in America. The civil rights movement of the 1960s had 2 very strong leaders who were agents for social change. However, they had different approaches to accomplish their goals. Those leaders were Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. The two had separate paths, but sources now say that toward the end of their lives, they started to become close to each other and share ideas. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929, in Atlanta, Georgia. He attended college at Morehouse College in the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. He was a valedictorian of his class in 1951. After being accepted at several universities for his doctorate studies, he enrolled at Boston University. He was an outspoken advocate for racial equality, and his mentor at Crozer Seminary encouraged him to view Christianity as a potential force for social change. Therefore, at the start of his career, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was already a strong leader. He became a Baptist minister. He married Coretta Scott. On March 2, 1955, a black girl refused to give up her seat on a local city bus to a white person in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested. Civil rights leaders in Montgomery met to organize efforts and possibly use this as a test case. Dr. King was a new leader in the community. He led the famous Montgomery City bus boycott. It lasted for 382 days. The African American community endured violence, ridicule, and walking to work in all kinds of weather. The case also went to court. The Montgomery City Bus Authority Company finally changed its policy. On August 28, 1963, Dr. King delivered a speech in Washington, D.C. at the famous March on Washington. It is one of the most famous speeches in American history. Dr. King addressed the entire nation. The event was televised. In his speech, Dr. King told America that even though the Civil War was 100 years ago, African Americans are still not free. Separate but equal is not equal. He shared his hope by saying,
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal.
In April of 1968, while in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. King was shot and killed. To this day, he is one of the most lauded leaders of the civil rights movement, and he holds a special place in American history. Malcolm X was a powerful leader. He was born on May 19, 1925, in Omaha, Nebraska. His father was a civil rights leader, so Malcolm faced racial prejudice before he was even born. His father faced frequent harassment from white supremacist groups. Malcolm remembered this and that in order to escape the racial violence, his family had to move to East Lansing, Michigan. When he became an adult, he traveled to Detroit, Michigan, to meet and work with the leader of the Nation of Islam in America, Eli Muhammad. Article 5 is a democratic way for the entire nation to hold a referendum on an important issue facing our country. It involves the U.S. Congress and the legislatures of all 50 states, who by a supermajority must vote in the affirmative or the amendment shall not pass. To date, none of the 27 amendments in the Constitution have been proposed by Constitutional Convention. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. It states that no United States citizen can be denied the right to vote on the basis of sex. It was ratified on August 18, 1920. The Constitution allows the states to determine the qualifications of voters, subject to limitations imposed by later amendments. Until the 1910s, most states did not allow women the right to vote. The amendment was the culmination of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, which fought at both state and national levels to achieve the vote. It effectively overruled Minor v. Harper-Sett, 88 U.S. 162, in which unanimous Supreme Court ruled that the 14th Amendment did not give women the right to vote. U.S. Supreme Court decisions are very hard to overturn. It can take 20 to 50 years before the composition of the sitting justices retire to have enough voters to overturn a prior decision, if the court decides to rehire the case at all. Knowing this, women leaders and activists looked to another branch of government to make changes. They started lobbying Congress and gathering political power in the legislative branch of government. The 19th Amendment was first introduced by Congress in 1878 by Senator Aaron A. Sargent. 41 years later, in 1919, Congress approved the amendment and submitted it to the states for ratification. It was ratified by the requisite number of states a year later, with Tennessee's ratification being the final vote needed to add the amendment to the Constitution. In Lesser v. Garnett, the Supreme Court rejected claims that the amendment was unconstitutionally adopted. The 19th Amendment was first introduced in Congress in 1878 by Senator Aaron A. Sargent. 41 years later, in 1919, Congress approved the amendment and submitted it to the states for ratification. It was ratified by the requisite number of states a year later, with Tennessee's ratification being the final vote needed to add the amendment to the Constitution. In Lesser v. Garnett, the Supreme Court rejected claims that the amendment was unconstitutionally adopted. On May 21, 1919, U.S. Representative James R. Mann, a Republican from Illinois and chairman of the Suffrage Committee, proposed the House resolution to approve the Susan Anthony Amendment granting women the right to vote. The measure passed the House 304-89, a full 42 votes above the required two-thirds majority. 2 weeks later, on June 4, 1919, the Senate passed the 19th Amendment by 2 votes over its two-thirds required majority, 56-25. The amendment was then sent to the states for ratification. Within 6 days of the ratification cycle, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin each ratified the amendment. Kansas, New York, and Ohio followed on June 16, 1919. By March of the following year, a total of 35 states had approved the amendment, 1 state shy of two-thirds required for ratification. Southern states were adamantly opposed to the amendment, however, and 7 of them, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Virginia had already rejected it before Tennessee's vote on August 18, 1920. It was up to Tennessee to tip the scale for women's suffrage. The outlook appeared bleak, given the outcomes in other southern states, and given the position of Tennessee's state legislators in their 48-48 tie. The state's decision came down to 23-year-old Representative Harry T. Byrne, a Republican from McKinn County, to cast the deciding vote. Although Byrne opposed the amendment, his mother convicted him to approve it. Mrs. Byrne reportedly wrote to her son, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." With Byrne's vote, the 19th Amendment was ratified. Certification by U.S. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby followed on August 26, 1920. On November 2nd of that same year, more than 8 million women across the U.S. voted in elections for the first time. It took over 60 years for the remaining 12 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. Mississippi was the last to do so on March 22, 1984. Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, 347 U.S., 483, was a landmark United States Supreme Court case in which the court declared state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students to be unconstitutional. The decision was a surprise because the decision overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which allowed state-sponsored segregation, insofar as it applied to public education. Handed down on May 17, 1954, the Warren Court's unanimous 9-0 decision stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. As a result, de jure racial segregation was ruled a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This ruling paved the way for integration and was a major victory of the civil rights movement. Although the most unlikely way to effect social change in these two movements, the courts in the legislative branch came through and led the way for significant social change and justice that had influenced American society and the world ever since. Brown v. Board of Education was actually the lead cause for 5 different cases that was before the court. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer who represented all of the African American children. The case was very important because at the time, non-white children in America did not have access to a good education. Local school boards could close black schools while at the same time give more money to the white schools. It wasn't just African American children who were denied access to a good education. Chinese American children were also prevented from attending white schools. He argued that separate schools for blacks and whites was unequal and violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. After the cases were heard, the justices were divided over the issue. They couldn't decide, so the cases were actually regarded a year later. During that time, one of the justices died and was replaced by Justice Earl Warren. He became the Chief Justice of the court and convinced the others to overturn the decision, Plessy v. Ferguson, which allowed segregation in schools. That was not the end. It was just the beginning. It took years for change to actually occur. Finally, in 1955, the U.S. Supreme Court told the 50 states to desegregate their public schools with all deliberate speed.
Easy now, you need figure down. Easy now, no need figure down. Rock that run, that this how we frown. Easy now, you need figure down. Easy now, no need figure down. Rock that run, that this how we